Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Before we begin, a brief orientation. Philosophy is at its best not when it resolves the unknown, but when it helps us approach it without fear or distortion. Nothing here asks for belief. Nothing asks for agreement. It simply invites you to move slowly, to notice how you meet the unfamiliar, and to let your understanding widen at its own pace. There are moments when a subject becomes so charged by speculation that it turns fragile. People approach it too quickly, or too confidently, or with the kind of hunger that bends the material into shapes that were never there. This essay begins from a quieter place. It is written for listeners who would rather think than react, who understand that the unknown is not an invitation to abandon reason, but an opportunity to practice it with greater care. The aim here is not to persuade, it is to create the conditions in which reflection is possible. What follows asks you to move slowly, not because the subject is frightening, but because it has been handled so poorly in the public sphere that it has accumulated distortions that make patience necessary. The material associated with Dr. James Lacatski does not require belief, it requires steadiness. His work sits in an unusual intersection of intelligence procedure, empirical reporting, and human experience. The most valuable thing the listener can bring is not conviction, but attention. The essay will offer no conclusion you must accept. It will offer a series of observations and invitations, each shaped to protect your ability to decide for yourself. It helps to remember that the unknown is not a rupture in the world. It is simply the part of reality that has not yet been placed in familiar categories. Philosophers from Jung to Hillman understood that human beings instinctively want to narrow what they encounter until it feels safe. Yet, there is a gentler response available. Instead of forcing the world to shrink, we can allow our understanding to grow. That does not mean embracing wild claims. It means recognizing that the limits of what we currently know are not the limits of what exists. This is where Dr. Lacatski becomes relevant. His public statements do not demand that anyone accept extraordinary interpretations. They present the residue that could not be dismissed, simplified, or shaped into more comfortable narratives. The carefulness with which he speaks is not evasive. It is the care of someone who understands that precision is a form of respect, both for the subject and for the audience. Listening to him does not require agreement. It requires the willingness to sit with material that has not yet revealed its final meaning. If there is an intention behind this essay, it is to help the listener find an inner posture capable of meeting the unknown without fear, cynicism, or surrender. Not all mysteries are warnings. Some are simply reminders that the world is larger than our habits of thought, and that our understanding grows best when we approach the unexplained with calm, patience, and a mind still willing to learn. Most people approach this subject with a quiet instinct to step back, not because they reject the possibility outright, but because they want the world to remain coherent. That instinct is understandable. We are accustomed to mysteries that dissolve under scrutiny, not ones that become more precise. Yet every so often a voice emerges that does not trade in spectacle or conjecture, a voice that simply describes what was observed and what could be confirmed. Dr. James Lacatski is one of those voices. His accounts do not ask the listener to believe anything unusual. They ask only that we resist the urge to look away before the details are fully understood. Clarity begins with the way he speaks. There is no dramatization, no narrative embellishment, no attempt to push the material toward a predetermined conclusion. He stays within the boundaries of what can be spoken under the structures that once governed his work. And he respects those boundaries even when they make his testimony quieter than people expect. That restraint is not a rhetorical choice. It is the product of a career inside programs where every word had to survive technical review, classification checks, and procedural oversight. When he says only what he is permitted to say, the silence around those statements is not mystery for its own sake. It is evidence of the constraints that shape them. Nothing in this opening requires the listener to abandon skepticism. Skepticism is the correct posture. What this material challenges is not skepticism itself, but the speed with which we sometimes try to restore familiar explanations when confronted with something that does not immediately fit. The details he presents are modest, but they remain consistent even when handled patiently. They do not point toward a conclusion. They point toward a question. What should we do when accounts from disciplined environments resist easy categorization, yet refuse to collapse under examination? To begin from that question is to set the right conditions for understanding the rest of the essay. Not belief, not excitement, not rejection, just the willingness to stay with the material long enough to let it speak in its own narrow, carefully bounded voice. The difficulty with understanding Dr. James Lacatski is not rooted in the strangeness of the material, but in the discipline with which he delivers it. He speaks in the measured cadence of someone who has lived inside systems where language is governed by review, restriction, and responsibility. His accounts are not shaped to persuade, they are shaped to comply. Every detail he offers has already passed through the Defence Office of Pre-Publication and Security Review, the clearance gateway known as DOPSAR that determines what may enter the public domain. This is not the posture of a storyteller. It is the posture of a former program lead who understands that precision is not optional when describing events that resist ordinary interpretation. This is why his restraint should not be mistaken for ambiguity. In environments shaped by classification, legitimacy is not created by expressive confidence. It is created by constraint. A statement is permitted only after it survives layers of technical checking, factual confirmation, and policy alignment. That process narrows what can be spoken until only the most stable material remains. When Lacatski names the boundaries he must follow, he is not gesturing toward hidden knowledge. He is showing how truth functions when the subject matter is sensitive enough to require structured oversight. Nothing speculative survives such a process. Only what is durable does. Philosophers like Hannah Arendt understood that bureaucratic truth does not emerge from personal conviction. It emerges from the procedures that defend accuracy against distortion. Seen through that lens, Lacatski's tone becomes easier to interpret. His careful pauses, his unwillingness to reach beyond the authorized frame, his refusal to assign meaning where only observation exists, all reflect an internal discipline shaped by years of working inside a system where interpretation was always secondary to verification. His silence is not evasive. It is part of the same structure that once governed the reports he supervised. This procedural context matters because it alters how the details should be read. When he describes advanced craft, unusual behaviours or events that remained unresolved, he is not offering conclusions. He is presenting the residue that remained after the filters removed everything unsound. These are not grand assertions. They are the fragments that resisted deletion. The very narrowness of what he says is what makes it significant. It is the part that could be spoken without breaking the rules that shaped his work. To recognise this is not to elevate the extraordinary. It is simply to understand that legitimacy here is not a claim of authority. It is the product of a system designed to ensure that only what can be supported survives into public view. Every attempt to approach this subject forces us to confront a deeper uncertainty about how the mind handles the unfamiliar. The events described in official programs do not simply challenge our models of physics. They challenge the quieter machinery by which we decide what counts as real. Jung understood this pressure well. When faced with something that does not fit the available categories, the mind reaches instinctively for symbolic language. It creates patterns, stories, and intuitions, not because it is irrational, but because it is trying to maintain coherence in the presence of something it has not yet learned to see. This is not a flaw, it is a fundamental feature of consciousness. Yet it becomes dangerous when we forget that this symbolic reflex is happening. The testimony that emerges from these investigations lives in that fragile space between perception and interpretation. Witnesses describe objects that move cleanly against the horizon, yet the experience refuses to settle into ordinary meaning. The data points remain exact, but the significance drifts. This is the gap that often gets filled with certainty too quickly. People assume that the presence of anomalies requires a spectacular explanation, or else none at all. The deeper truth sits somewhere quieter. What we encounter here is not a demand for belief. It is a demand for honesty about the way perception falters when confronted with the unfamiliar. Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote that perception is never a neutral act. It is shaped by expectation, fear, desire, and prior experience. His insight matters here because so many accounts from trained observers involve moments where their own senses seem unprepared for what is happening. They report consistent movement, consistent shape, consistent behaviour, yet an internal hesitation appears, a subtle feeling that the experience is bypassing the interpretive frameworks they rely on to make sense of the world. This hesitation is not evidence of confusion. It is evidence of consciousness encountering something it cannot immediately classify. This is the psychological terrain in which the UAP problem becomes philosophically interesting. Not because it suggests an extraordinary origin, but because it reveals how tightly our understanding of reality is bound to habit. When events do not conform to those habits, the mind looks for shortcuts. It fills the space with premature conclusions or defensive dismissals. Both are understandable, both are traps. What Lacatski's material quietly invites is a slower movement, the recognition that ambiguity is not a failure of understanding, but part of the process by which understanding begins. To stay with that ambiguity requires patience. It requires acknowledging that the mind reaches for symbols before it reaches for reason, and that this reflex tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the phenomena we are trying to interpret. There is a point in any difficult subject where the search for clarity becomes tangled with the need to defend one's intuitions. With UAPs, the knot tightens quickly. Each attempt to reduce the phenomenon to something manageable seems to generate a residue that refuses simplification. Reports collapse into counter-reports, patterns dissolve into ambiguity, and the mind reaches for explanations that feel comfortable rather than true. This is where the conversation usually fractures. We are accustomed to mysteries that fade with scrutiny. We are far less prepared for mysteries that sharpen when examined. The testimony that Dr. James Lacatski shares sits precisely in this uncomfortable space. It is not spectacular in the way people imagine. It is something slower, stranger, and far more difficult to dismiss. It is the kind of material that does not ask for belief, but for a steadier form of attention. The difficulty is not the strangeness of the events themselves, but the disruption they create in our usual ways of knowing. Simone Weil argued that attention is a moral virtue, an act that demands a willingness to withstand uncertainty without collapsing it into premature meaning. This is the discipline that Lacatski's account quietly requires. His descriptions of objects that move in ways that defy our intuitions are not invitations to leap into fantasy. They are invitations to stop assuming that reality must conform to the shapes we prefer. The anomalies are unsettling because they resist our cognitive habits, not because they invite impossible conclusions. In this light, the strange behaviour of these craft becomes less an argument about extraterrestrial origin and more an argument about epistemic humility. Something is happening in our perceptual margins that we are not trained to recognise, and the responsible response is not dismissal, but steadiness. This is the part of the conversation that often goes missing. People hear the word phenomenon and assume the question is what. Lacatski's material asks the slower question how. How do we perceive? How do we interpret? How do we avoid forcing ambiguous events into familiar frames? Carl Jung once observed that the psyche reacts to the unknown with symbols long before it reacts with comprehension. The same dynamic appears here. The public reaches for narratives of visitors and cover-ups, not because the facts demand them, but because the mind distrusts the vacuum left by uncertainty. But the vacuum is the point. It is the place where careful thought is still possible. The value of Lacatski's testimony is not that it provides an answer. It is that it interrupts the reflex to search for quick ones. It holds the tension in place long enough for deeper questions to arise about perception, bias, attention, and meaning. The phenomenon is elusive, but our reactions to it are not. They are predictable, patterned, and revealing. To take this material seriously is not to embrace the extraordinary. It is to acknowledge the limits of our interpretive comfort and to proceed anyway. He is careful to distinguish between what is allowed to be said and what can only be implied by the structure of his constraints. This is the part most people overlook because they assume secrecy functions like a wall. In reality, it functions more like a silhouette. Every refusal casts a shape. Every cleared phrase draws an outline. When Lacatski repeats that his books contain everything he has been authorized to make public, he is not diminishing the phenomena. He is signaling the boundary of the sanctioned domain. And when he repeatedly emphasizes that some answers cannot be given even behind closed doors, he is describing a different category of limit altogether, one that is built not from classification, but from the architecture of oversight itself. This is where the legitimacy of his restraint becomes visible. He does not embellish, he does not stretch, he refuses to interpret beyond the cleared material even when prompted. That refusal is not defensive. It is operational discipline. It tells you that the clearance structure is real, that DOPSA review is not a formality but an active gate, and that his phrasing is not personal preference but the residue of a process designed to prevent drift. In a landscape crowded with claims, that discipline draws a clean contrast. It does not ask you to believe him. It asks you to observe the precision with which he stays inside the lines, and yet the lines themselves are revealing. When he discusses false documents seeded into official systems or the persistence of deliberate misdirection, he is not indulging in conspiracy rhetoric. He is describing what counterintelligence does. It saturates an environment with noise until signal becomes indistinguishable from distraction. His insistence that the cleared books are the only reliable source is therefore not rhetorical positioning. It is a corrective to an ecosystem designed to overwhelm the public with contradictory narratives. His own testimony becomes an anchor, not because it offers certainty, but because it refuses to participate in the inflation of uncertainty. This leaves the listener in an unusual position. The more you attend to what he does not say, the clearer the outline becomes. The legitimacy is not located in dramatic revelation, but in the coherence of his restraint. He describes programs, clearances, oversight channels, approved phrasing, missing documents, false entries, and the difficulty of navigating an ecosystem in which even accurate information can be rendered inert through misdirection. It is not spectacle, it is structure. And once you see the structure, the phenomenon stops looking like an enigma and starts looking like a domain in which the usual tools of understanding are insufficient. That realization, quietly delivered, is more disorienting than any claim he could have made outright. He keeps drawing a boundary that most people never notice, the distinction between information that is merely classified and information that is ontologically destabilizing. It is not the secrecy that matters. It is the nature of what the secrecy is protecting. When Lacatski says he cannot answer a question, he is not signaling evasion. You can hear it in the precision of his phrasing, the careful repetition that what he says has been cleared, word for word, through DOPSA review. That discipline is both a constraint and a clue. This is where his work intersects with the deep philosophical instinct that truth is never simply a matter of access, but of readiness. Foucault understood this as the governance of knowledge, the way institutions regulate not only what can be known, but what a society is capable of integrating without collapse. Jung saw it as the psychic limit, the point where the human imagination breaks under its own projections. Lacatski stands at the crossing of these two insights and treats the boundary not as a wall, but as a pressure point. If the public has not been given full detail, it is not necessarily because the truth is dangerous, but because the interpretive frameworks required to receive it are not yet stable. You can see this when he speaks about the documents themselves. He describes them as complete, vetted, reviewed, cleansed and approved, yet still only a fraction of what exists behind the curtain. He refuses to dramatize this gap, but he refuses to minimize it too. The result is an unusual form of legitimacy. He is not asserting belief or theory or speculation, but a disciplined adherence to what is permissible. In a domain filled with noise, that restraint becomes its own epistemic signal. It tells you the limits are real. It tells you the clearance boundaries matter. And it tells you that the contours of what he cannot say are as important as the content of what he can. This ultimately is why his testimony produces such disquiet. We are used to secrets that hide information. We are not used to secrets that protect coherence. His refusals are not walls but markers, revealing where human comprehension still lacks the range or the framing to metabolize the implications. The task, then, is not to demand revelation, but to cultivate the capacity to receive what has already been revealed. Only by stabilizing our attention can we even begin to understand what sits on the other side of those boundaries, waiting for a world that has learned how to hear it. He keeps circling back to a single unsettling instruction: follow the evidence, but do not assume you understand what it is evidence of. This is the part of his testimony that most people skip over because it sounds too strange to take seriously and too serious to dismiss. The investigators under his direction discovered that the moment you isolate a UAP event from its surrounding disturbances, you begin telling the wrong story. Sightings were never only sightings. They arrived with physiological effects, with anomalous light phenomena, with entities that behaved like intrusions from the edges of perception, rather than visitors with clear intention. The pattern was not one thing, but a convergence. You can sense the methodological shock embedded in this. The intelligence personnel who flew out to the ranch came expecting propulsion problems and sensor anomalies. Instead, they found encounters that destabilized the categories they were trained to use. People who had spent their lives in controlled environments suddenly spoke about creatures, apparitions, distortions in space, events that followed them home and spread into their families. These were not people seeking attention. These were credentialed observers forced to confront data that violated their models of reality. And Lacatski never distances himself from these accounts. He treats them as integral, not peripheral. What he is really suggesting is that the phenomenon is the wrong scale for our current tools. Not too large, not too small, but operating along vectors that our epistemic habits cannot yet track. We look for propulsion signatures. It operates through states that resemble consciousness effects. We look for material traces. It leaves impressions that behave like symbolic events. We want clean boundaries. It erodes the line between environment and experience. The failure is not in the witnesses. The failure is in the frameworks they brought with them. This is why he resists any attempt to study UAP as if they were isolated technologies. In his view, the craft, the effects, the distortions all belong to the same field of activity. Separate them and you sever the coherence. Hold them together and you begin to see how little we understand. His caution is not rhetorical, it is operational. Misframing the phenomenon doesn't simply yield bad conclusions. It prevents you from noticing the structure of the interaction itself. And this is where his restraint becomes its own kind of warning. The data does not conform to our expectations because our expectations are built on assumptions about the nature of reality that may not apply here. The point is not that the world is stranger than we think. It is that the world may be structured in ways that require a different form of attention entirely, one that can hold the technological, the psychological, and the ontological in the same field without collapsing them into explanation. There is a point in the story where the question no longer concerns what happened, but what our encounter with the unknown reveals about us. This is where the material becomes most unsettling in a quiet and necessary way. Dr. James Lacatski's accounts do not simply describe events. They expose the limits of the conceptual tools we bring to them. When phenomena appear that do not fit our inherited categories, we discover how deeply we depend on those categories to maintain a sense of coherence. The unknown does not shatter our worldview. It shows us that the worldview was narrower than we believed. Thinkers like James Hillman understood this tension. They saw the psyche as something that must sometimes be enlarged rather than protected. When faced with material that stretches our sense of what is possible, the ethical task is not to decide whether it should be believed. It is to decide whether we are willing to let our interpretive range grow wide enough to hold it without distortion. Hannah Arendt described this as the courage to think without banisters. Nothing guides you except the discipline of honesty and the refusal to simplify a reality that has not yet explained itself. In this way, Lacatski's Restraint becomes a kind of mirror. He refuses to rush toward metaphysical claims. He refuses to dramatize. He refuses to conceal the limits placed upon him. His discipline forces the listener to confront their own. If we demand certainty, we are asking for a comfort that the material cannot provide. If we demand dismissal, we are asking to be protected from the discomfort of what does not yet make sense. The unknown here is not a threat. It is a test of interpretive character. Edouard Glissant wrote about the right to opacity, the idea that some realities should not be forced into clarity simply because clarity is comforting. This applies here with unusual precision. The events described do not owe us an explanation. Their legitimacy does not depend on our ability to frame them neatly. To insist otherwise is to reduce the world to what fits within our current vocabulary, rather than allowing our vocabulary to evolve toward the world. This is why this subject intersects with philosophy rather than speculation. It asks whether we can inhabit uncertainty without collapsing it into fantasy or denial. It asks whether we can allow reality to be larger than our descriptions of it. It asks whether we can treat the limits of understanding not as a failure, but as an invitation to refine the way we think. The unknown becomes an ethical terrain, one in which patience, humility, and care determine whether we distort what we encounter or meet it on its own terms. The closer you look, the more the ground seems to shift beneath the questions themselves. Not because the claims are unstable, but because the frameworks we normally use to absorb information of this magnitude are no longer aligned with the scale of what is being described. You begin to see why someone like Dr. James Lacatski speaks inside such narrow corridors of permission. It is not simply classification. It is not simply risk. It is the deeper problem that human meaning collapses when forced to hold evidence it cannot yet interpret. The ambiguity is not a shield. It is a boundary. And yet it is this very boundary that reveals something about us. Every time he refuses a question, the refusal itself becomes a contour of the phenomenon. You hear the precision, not denial, not speculation, but a calibrated adherence to what has been explicitly cleared through official review. That discipline is its own kind of testimony. It tells you that the limits are real. It tells you that the mechanisms around those limits are real. And it tells you that this is not myth or metaphor, but a living architecture of secrecy, oversight, and consequence. The temptation is to search for a final line, the moment where everything tilts towards certainty, but nothing in the record offers that comfort. Instead, you are left with a form of attention that must hold two truths at once, that something exists which exceeds our present comprehension, and that the institutions tasked with managing it operate according to logics most people never encounter. What emerges is not revelation, but a kind of philosophical vertigo, the recognition that understanding may require new capacities, new disciplines of perception, perhaps even new forms of collective maturity. If there is an ethic here, it is not belief, it is not disbelief. It is the discipline of staying with what has been said, neither amplifying it nor diminishing it. The discipline of noticing the gaps, the permissions, the careful phrasing that signals both proximity and constraint. The discipline of accepting that some truths may not yet be survivable in the open, not because they are dangerous, but because we are not prepared for what they would demand of us. And the thread that runs through everything is simple, though its implications are not. What is known is larger than what can currently be spoken. What can be spoken is larger than what the public has been allowed to hear. And the space between these two realities is where our attention must rest, steady and unhurried, until the next permitted detail shifts the boundary again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast. Each episode is built through rigorous ethical and research-based protocols. I use a digital narrator to help manage the workload. My goal is to invite fresh perspectives, thoughtful curiosity, and deeper understanding. Every episode takes considerable time and reflection to produce. Throughout the process, I'm guided by a strong moral core. If you enjoy my work, please consider letting me and others know. A review or rating on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or your preferred platform makes an enormous difference. Your support helps the podcast reach new listeners, fosters meaningful discussion, and keeps this project alive. Until next time.